There were distressing scenes in the West African state of Ivory Coast today as relatives of the 19 people who died in the crash at a football stadium tried to discover how the accident had happened. The sheer press of people trying to get in is being blamed. The event has troubling echoes of the tragedy 20 years ago at the Liverpool-Nottingham Forest match at Hillsborough in Sheffield, where 96 people died. At Hillsborough, the police were to blame for shepherding fans onto an already overcrowded terrace. But as Peter Marshall, who was at the game, reports, many of the Liverpool families believe there's been a cover-up over what happened next.
At Liverpool, they're still singing Justice for the 96. Nearly 2 decades after the disaster at Hillsborough, they're still waiting for answers. They still want to know how and why so many died at a football match. Officially, the police were blamed for their lack of any basic crowd control, incompetence and negligence which led to the disaster. But there are other questions which remain, questions which still trouble those whose lives have been scarred.
If you're able to resolve the issues, completely finalise and everyone was happy, then you could let it go and remember the event and just move on, you know. Well, until you get a resolution to some of those things and stop the cover-up, really, isn't it?
That's what you feel
Yeah,
it has been covered up.
I think it's always been covered up, yeah.
There was a disaster at Hillsborough in the main disaster. Then you had another disaster which followed it. And that is a can of, as Margaret said, it's a can of worms that no one wishes to open.
Just across from Liverpool's home ground, there's a shop for one of the campaigns for the truth of what happened when they went to a semi-final at Hillsborough in Sheffield in 1989. It's well established how badly led police presided over chaos. The failure to plan any sort of queue for 24,000 Liverpool fans led to a terrifying crush outside Hillsborough. I was in it and explained that night.
Those of us who were trying to get into the Leppings Lane end of the ground, the Liverpool end, were quite perturbed and angered at the lack of adequate policing, which led to dreadful crushes outside, which in turn led to the police opening the double gates because they said they couldn't cope with the awful crush.
What happened was the police opened a gate, adding to a killing crush inside on the terraces. With people dying before their eyes, the police were then fatally slow to act. The Liverpool Memorial records the 96 who died. Down the years, the bereaved and survivors have struggled and failed to have anyone held accountable, not only over the failure of crowd control, but also over what happened after the crush. The timing is all important. The coroner ruled that all those who died had sustained their injuries by 3:15. And that timing's been crucial for the last 20 years because it's meant, whatever the intention, that effectively there's been no meaningful inquiry into the failings of the emergency response at Hillsborough. Now, many of the families believe their loved ones were still alive after 3:15, and perhaps some could even have been saved given proper medical assistance. But the 3:15 cut-off means there's been no accountability.
But I've always been concerned about the 3:15 cut-off time. I think it's been a time of convenience. I don't believe it. I've never accepted it. Because of what I saw.
The Isle of Bute off the Scottish coast is a place to breathe, as far from the horrors of Hillsborough as you might wish for. Tony Edwards came here to escape the memories. He's the only South Yorkshire ambulance man to have got to the Liverpool end of the pitch on that bleak day. Now he recalls answering 999, arriving at the ground and facing hell.
And a police officer came up to the side door, pulled the sliding door open and said to me, "You can't go on, they're still fighting."
They're still fighting?
Yeah, that's what he said. He said they're still fighting. This was obviously not a fight from a good way down the pitch. So we looked to the chief ambulance officer, shouted to him and said we couldn't go on. And he opened up the other side door and said, "I don't give a who's saying you can't go on." And he slapped on our two-tone horns and said, I want you to go onto the pitch and don't stop until you get to the far end.
Over 40 ambulances went to Hillsborough and were left waiting or diverted to other parts of the ground. But at 3:36, 21 minutes after the coroner's cut-off time, we see Tony Edwards' ambulance, alone, drive inside down to the Liverpool end.
And just as we were getting on, that's when I noticed the first body on some billboards. And I thought, is he dead?
So the scene was chaos?
Yes, the scene was absolute chaos. But in the main, people were doing their best. Most of these people had never seen a dead body before in their lives. And so when they were prioritising themselves and putting casualties onto billboards...
To carry them as stretchers, as makeshift stretchers?
To make makeshift stretchers. They placed the bodies on the back, which is an indication that you know, if you had somebody unconscious, somebody not breathing, and you can't assist them, you turn them on the front in order to be in what we know as the recovery position.
So they were doing it the wrong way, because they didn't know?
In the panic, they were doing it the wrong way, and nobody knew. I think, had we've got crews onto the pitch, had we organised ourselves in the proper way that you'd organise a major incident, then today the story may have been very different.
In Liverpool, nearly 100 bereaved families and many more survivors are braced for the 20th anniversary of Hillsborough, their disaster. Of course, they still grieve privately, but their anger is public and focused. James Aspinall was 18 when he went to Hillsborough. After 20 years, his mother says they've yet to be told the truth about how he died.
If James had have died on his own, he'd have had his own private inquest. I would have found out then the time, where, why, when, and especially who helped him. Now, I have had none of them answers at all, really.
But the point is that the coroner would have said James would still have been lost, he'd still have died.
How can he say that?
You know, they weren't declared dead till 4 o'clock, so you must assume that maybe they had some life before that.
Doreen Jones lost her son Richard and his girlfriend Tracy.
You know, even if only one person could have been saved, then, you know, lessons must be learnt about Hillsborough of how to go about these rescue operations and how triage should be done. But nothing like that happened.
There was no triage, there was no prioritisation of who to save, who to work on.
And in fact, people were feeling for a pulse and finding none and throwing a coat over their head so everybody else walked past.
Phil Scraton's an academic and author who spent years researching Hillsborough, the coroner's inquest and the legal implications.
Certainly the pathologists who were giving evidence at the inquest believed that the 3:15 cut-off was appropriate. But I'm afraid expert opinion by other senior pathologists since have said that there were people who could well have had survivable injuries who had actually received those injuries in the pens prior to 3:15. A number of people recovered after 3:15. 2 people were left in a persistent vegetative state. It's a continuum. It's not one or the other. So medical intervention is at that time, in that intervening period, could well have saved lives.
Kevin Williams was 15. His mother's been told he was still alive and even calling her name shortly before 4 o'clock.
I know from when he came out, when he was pulled out at 3:28, he was run across the pitch by 3 Liverpool fans. And when he was taken into the gym by an special WPC that day.
So what's the next legal move now then?
We're going to go back to the Attorney General yet again and ask the Attorney General to ask the High Court to direct a further inquiry. We're also going to look at the possibility of asking the government to have a public inquiry, which may be realistically the only way of finding out what really happened.
It's bad enough to lose a child, but not to know, how they died. You just can't move on.
I'd do anything to get it all opened again. And I would fight to the day I die to get it open, until somebody, somewhere, comes out and gives us the truth of what happened after 3:15.
On the Isle of Bute, Tony Edwards, the former ambulance man, prepares for the 20th anniversary of the day he can't forget, the day he believes the truth was lost.
I think part of the problem is once you start with not holding your hands up and admitting the truth, it develops its own life, doesn't it? And both sides develop their own life. People having to prove stuff and people not and denying stuff and then eventually holding their hands up. Instead of, you have to do these things honestly, and I don't think it was ever done really honestly, and that's been the mistake, really.
A mistake which continues to pile pain upon grief 20 years on.
Peter Marshall reports.